All right, ladies and gentlemen, so today we're going to pick up talking about your endocrine system. And I'm going to combine your chapter 39 and chapter 45 together into one system. Chapter 39 really kind of goes over the plant hormones. We're not going to go super in depth there, but I will give you some background as it does have the tendency to show up on the exam on occasion. And so the overall arching focus will be on chapter 45 and our actual human endocrine system. So if we get started, we'll take a look at really just jumping into connecting chapter 11's information of just how we go through communication between cells, and what this ultimately then looks like in living organisms, multicellular organisms. And if we take it from a human standpoint, we're really looking at your body's communication systems being a function of both your endocrine system and your nervous system. And these two systems very much work together in order to maintain your body's overall homeostasis. So if we look at your endocrine system, this is more the hormones that are being sent out. So the actual responses we get from that system tend to be considerably slower, but on the reverse, they often are a little more longer acting in the response that they produce. That's not always 100% guarantee, but overarching, that's usually how this works. So your endocrine system is involved in all sorts of things like your reproductive development, um, energy, metabolism, growth, behavior, all of that stuff is connected to your endocrine system. At the same time, you've got your nervous system, which tends to be a little bit more high speed, a little more regulated to other cells. We're talking specialized cells like your neurons. And so we're going to pick up with that nervous system kind of as the last thing that we do this year. So, that being said, you're going to find that there are definitely going to be pieces of your nervous system impacting the release of things like your hormones, and the reverse can also be true. So, if we take a look kind of once again backtracking and connecting this to chapter 11, let's just talk big picture one more time and talk about the types of signaling that your body can do. So the endocrine signaling is just one of several ways in which we can get information to coordinate efforts and coordinate functions between animal cells. When we talk about endocrine signaling, we're talking really about these hormones. And those hormones are just chemical signals that get secreted usually out into your circulatory system, and then can communicate all sorts of messages without the body. Cool thing is that these hormones, although we're releasing them systemically through your bloodstream or your tissue fluid, um, they are still very targeted in the responses that they produce because they are ligands, just like we talked about in chapter 11, which means that they are specifically shaped for the receptors that they then coordinate to. So it's very much a similar idea to a substrate and enzyme, meaning that that hormone is specifically shaped to only fit in its own receptor. So it's only going to work on the cells that actually contain those receptors. Um, so this endocrine signaling then can coordinate homeostasis, mediate stimuli, regulate growth, development, all sorts of stuff just by being released and then only being activated in certain cells. So, when we talk about signaling and those signals that get transmitted, remember that they really do fit into two criteria. First and foremost, what is the type of secreting cell? And then what is the route in which that signal takes in order to reach the target cell that it will ultimately cause a response in. So the figure here you're looking at is that endocrine signaling. We're talking about a secreting cell somewhere in the body, releasing that hormone then into the bloodstream, and that target cell that it actually works on can be in all sorts of places in the body. It doesn't necessarily have to be directly adjacent to that secreting cell. So remember that we can have that situation where those cells are locally regulated. Remember, local regulators are molecules that act over short distances because they're going to get there via diffusion. So that secreting cell will release that molecule out into its environment. But remember, diffusion of a molecule, moving from that high concentration to low concentration, really is only effective across short distances. So we can talk about local signaling. If it's paracrine signaling, then that means that target cell just happens to lie very close by to the cell that's actually doing the secreting of that local regulator. But they can also then get used on themselves, and that's the idea of autocrine signaling. So they'll release that molecule. It will probably go and target some other local cells, but it's also going to activate itself as well. The local regulators are the ones that are going to sort of link neighboring cells, do really coordinated efforts right inside your tissues. So these local regulators can be a whole host of things like cytokines and growth factors that we talked about during cell division, when we need a local cell to all of a sudden get stimulated to replace a damaged or dead cell, for example. Nitric oxide, also a local regulator. Prostaglandins are another local regulator, and these guys do a whole bunch of functions, from promoting fever and inflammation to intensifying sensations of pain, when we need to sort of regulate and get platelets to damaged cells, injuries, um, in early clot formation. So they're doing a lot of processes that have to do with cell death, cell damage, and then they'll probably also then come in and potentially influence the release of things like those growth factors if that's necessary as well. Not that we're going to talk about this here, but just kind of a reminder of other types of signaling. We'll get to this when we get to your nervous system, but don't forget that your synaptic signaling is also something that's relatively local. So your neurons will form these specialized junctions, what we call synapses. That's what you're seeing right here. These really close little junctures between themselves and the target cell. At those synapses, those neurons can secrete those neurotransmitters, which are also specifically shaped to the receptors that they work on. Also, something that's only going to work across short distances because it's going to be another diffusion based process here as well. So, more to come on this in the next section. You can also have situations where you've got this combination of the two, where you've got a neuroendocrine signaling. So these are some really specialized neurosecretory cells that will actually secrete what we call neurohormones. So you'll see the synapse here, just like we saw a moment ago, but rather than secreting neurotransmitters that work on receptors on a target cell right next door, instead, these neurohormones actually get released into the bloodstream, and then they will go work similar to a normal hormone, and target a cell somewhere else in the body. So it's kind of a combination of that endocrine signaling with that neuron signaling in one package. We also brought up about the term pheromones a few times this year. So not only are we really focusing for the most part on cell communication within a single organism, there's also plenty of communication that's happening chemically between organisms, and pheromones are often one of those major chemical components. So pheromones are those molecules that get released into the environment as opposed to being released between cells in their own body. And pheromones serve a whole bunch of functions, something like our little ants here in the picture. How do those ants know how to follow a particular trail from food to their home? Well, because those leader ants are the ones secreting these pheromones, setting down this trail, and being able to then allow everybody else behind them to smell it and know where they're going. Lots of animals use pheromones to define their territories. use them as warnings against predators, also to attract potential mates. So there's lots of communication going on that really has nothing to do with what an organism can see um, or hear, but what they can smell. And sometimes they're not even fully keenly aware of what they're smelling, but they know that their brain chemistry knows what to do with that information.